Hello and welcome to the second episode of Buddies Without Organs, a podcast about Deleuze, but I realised earlier on also about Guattari, because you can't really take the one without the other. Even the bits where Deleuze is writing on his own, I think he's still has like a precognitive awareness of what Guattari is going to do with him. But I digress. Immediately I digress. I'm Sean and I'm here with Matt.
Hello. Hi Sean, how you doing?
I'm doing absolutely beautifully. It's been a horrible, grim and rainy and indeed hailing day down on the south coast, but tonight it is nice and calm and still and cloudless all of a sudden. It was actually quite eerie because all day has been this blanket of clouds overhead. But when I stepped outside to do the recycling and just stars, hello planets. That was a lovely, just a really weird transition between which I just completely missed the actual movement from one state to another. That was actually quite lovely.
I think we're getting into that time of year now where things start getting a bit weird, because we're forecast snow here tonight, and I'm actually really excited about it. I've been a bit giddy all day like a little kid. Just waiting for that white sprinkle to come down. I don't know when the last time I've actually been around it snowing. It feels like it's been ages. It's been a couple of years.
Because we had a couple of... I am aware that this is a philosophy podcast and we're doing the British thing of talking about the weather, but I get to insist on doing that. Because we have had like a spate of a couple of like very warm winters the last 2 years. Like last year, obviously, we had that absolutely horrendous day in February, which was about like 20 degrees or something obscene like that. So it has been reassuringly normal that we've had a very cold and dark winter. It would be. I don't think I would have coped with another humid winter on top of everything else that's been going on. I like a little bit of meteorological normalcy on top of all the horrible shit we've been living with all year. But this is not a COVID podcast. This is a philosophy podcast, and tonight we are talking about the Plane of Immanence, aren't we, Matt?
Yes, which feels like a quite natural progression, I think, from an inaugural episode on The Body Without Organs, but maybe we're sort of zooming out a bit further. And it was interesting because reading this, I guess we should say straight off the bat, as usual, that we decided to read together the chapter called The Plane of Immanence from What is Philosophy by Deleuze and Guattari, their final collaboration. And I think it's quite nice actually that you mentioned because it's true, we're going to have to keep aware of the fact that we might sometimes, as though we're focused on Deleuze, and because he has, I guess, the bigger body of work, we can't separate Guattari here. But that's quite why you can't, or how you can't, or why you shouldn't is probably even part of this week's topic, I guess. Because the one thing I pulled out from reading this chapter was a quote where they write that only friends can set out a plane of immanence as a ground from which idols have been cleared. To which I added in our notes, friends, but what about buddies? But I think that's cool because maybe that's how they start either Anti-Oedipus or 1,000 Plateaus, where they sort of say, both of us were already multiples, so 2 was already a crowd, or that's definitely not verbatim, but something along those lines.
Yeah, that's from 1,000 Plateaus. Yeah.
Yeah, but rather than have themselves like they're kind of playing with it almost as if they're this sort of thing like monstrosity of like merging together. But actually, here it becomes a bit more. There's something a bit more gentle about it, that they are just friends sharing thoughts. And that interweaving is really important, not just for philosophy, but for being, for communication. And I guess that's partly what they're trying to unearth in this whole book, how philosophy isn't just something you do, it's something that emerges between friends. Yes,
it's interesting to try and identify, just off the top of my head, other philosophers like that, because there is... I think the image that we've inherited is the philosopher as... Well, kind of like, the Nietzschean philosopher, the Hyperborean, alone on his, and it is often his, mountaintop, with this kind of and this is obviously very true of Nietzsche, but I think this is something that's kind of like in the background of all philosophers, really, is the philosopher is someone who has removed themselves from the crowd and has sought somewhere quiet to think, and in so doing has already kind of like made a pronouncement against being with others. I could only become a philosopher once I had removed myself. And because when we talk about philosophers, we talk about proper nouns. We talk about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and we think of those famous stories about Kant being someone who's so completely caught up in his own world that you could set your watch by his schedule and so on. But at the same time, obviously none of that's true, because even if these are people who didn't get on with anyone else and they just like sit quietly in their rooms and write, as Deleuze and Guattari note, we are all of us already multiple, and we are none of us an island either. We are all, no matter what, we are all caught in the midst of everything that is going on around us. And actually, just to think of the example of Kant, Kant is Kant is propelled into his most famous thinking by reading David Hume, and one wonders almost, what would a friendship with Hume have produced, or a friendship with Swedenborg, who he always regretted not having met in person. And it's something quite nice about that Deleuze and Guattari come as a double act almost. Even though both of them produced works in their own name, Deleuze's two most rigorously philosophical or traditionally philosophical works, I guess, The Logic of Sense and Repetition and Difference, or Difference and Repetition, are produced under his own name, and then the stuff with Guattari comes along a little bit later. But there is something nice about philosophers wearing that on their sleeve by announcing we are a collective, we are a multiple. I mean, it's stupid of me, but of course I just realised the other example is Marx and Engels, of course. The other great double act.
But yeah, it's interesting that as well to think. I mean, I was thinking about it when you mentioned Nietzsche, because I feel like in a way Nietzsche, to my mind, is like this sort of prime philosopher of friendship, but in a way kind of counterintuitively, because I mean, I always think of like Nietzsche and Wagner, but Nietzsche's thought seems to go in that strange direction because he sort of feels betrayed by Wagner, I think, in a lot of ways. And it's precisely his failed friendships and failed relationships that kind of spur him on to kind of to see what's wrong with the world almost. That if there's anything that he's trying to solve, it's that. And yeah, it's interesting for Kant especially, to think about how he would have friendships with Hume. But I guess that's something that a personal favourite of mine being Bataille, and Bataille certainly takes up. He tries to be the ultimate friend to Nietzsche, the one he never really had. Someone who tries to produce a kind of Nietzschean work and take him in new directions, as if that's what friends do. You take a friend by the hand and you take them somewhere. You share experiences. You don't just dictate, and you don't appropriate, and you don't whatever else. Which was the fate that, as much as Nietzsche felt betrayed by Wagner, we can sort of say he was betrayed by his sister as well, and the way that she sort of forced his hand into Hitler's, sort of despite a lot of what he was interested in. And I think it's those kind of relationships. Yeah, I mean, that's just that there. I think there are so many of them, but they're not discussed really quite openly. Because we are so obsessed with like a canon in that sense of like a series of individuals, but never how they link up.
But it's interesting just to reflecting on philosophy produced as a group effort, at least, or at least not as an individual effort. If we go all the way back to, the beginning of the Western tradition, which we date back to Socrates, obviously, Socrates and to Plato, and everything we have about Socrates through Plato is always Socrates meets a friend and they have a conversation about philosophy. However, it's never the two of them. Well, it's never really the two of them together on this journey as equals, discovering the truth of a matter. It is always Socrates as the gadfly of correcting the friend who he meets and explaining to him, or rather encouraging him to understand why he was wrong but why he, Socrates, was right. So it's not a collaborative effort. But that being said, maybe the fact that Plato's philosophy is created in these literally dialectical forms is at least a testament to the necessity of discussion. And it is interesting as well to think that even though it is always Socrates helping people understand why they're wrong, it is always in the context of very everyday things that are happening, like meeting someone in the marketplace, or meeting one of his hot boyfriends by a lake and talk to because he was out there composing poetry or something, or as happens here more than once at a dinner party, or with the symposium, it's literally a wine, sort of like a wine party after a poetry contest, if I remember correctly, or the Republic. The whole thing of the Republic is this dinner party he gets talks into going to, and of course these are all things that friends do. Well, maybe not literally sort of like tracking down sort of like boy lovers on the riverbanks, but certainly sort of like just chatting shit in the pub is something that we absolutely all do. And indeed, which one of us hasn't fallen into the Socratic persona of just insistently explaining to our friends why everything they've said is wrong?
Right. Well, I guess that's the interesting thing, I suppose, about dialectics, right? And especially when we get to, I guess we're just going to bring in the entire canon at this point, but that's as if Hegel kind of, he saves the dialectic from the Socratic dialogue. He makes it a proper exchange and a proper synthesis, rather than there being some sort of I can't think off the top of my head where if Hegel ever talks about friends in this way, but it seems like there's that sense that you have to, and in a way it's kind of similar to, this is probably quite heretical actually, but maybe there's a similarity with Deleuze there, where Hegel has to take that notion of communication and abstract it and make it kind of more I guess immanent to itself, that suggestion that that there is a process here, that a sort of proper functioning, a proper conceptual functioning that we can follow, and it kind of becomes, in one sense, you could say it's an ethics, or you could say it's it's a logic, it's a science. There's a science of communication almost, or I'm not a Hegel scholar, so maybe I'm just completely. But I always I've been kind of always fascinated by that relationship. But I guess Deleuze makes that far more explicit, because that's the one thing that I think is really quite lovely, where he sort of says that it's not just, it kind of, in a sense of abstracting things, it's not just that philosophy is something that is definitely produced through friends and through friendships. But also there's a sense that the philosopher, he says, or they say, I should say, Deleuze and Guattari say that the philosopher is the concept's friend. Philosopher sort of meaning friend of wisdom. But I think they take that notion very seriously, that it's not just this isn't a casual acquaintance that you can mistreat and kind of take for granted. There's a certain level of responsibility there, maybe, that isn't quite so it can't be dissolved, I suppose, is one way of putting it. It can't be dissolved into the stringent logics of Hegelianism, maybe, or of the kind of the viciousness of Nietzsche. There's a sense that there's a sense of give and take that is innately social rather than philosophical, and putting that first, I think, though to read it feels quite soft in a way. I don't know how else to put it, as if there's sort of being a bit like sort of the bleeding heart philosophers have kind of emerged to talk about how nice it is to be friends. But I think there's something that's really serious in there. They give a philosophical weight to friendship, which I think is is never, at least there's plenty that have made that explicit, but never towards these ends, towards philosophy itself, rather than just the other, as a lot of sort of ethicists would do in the 20th century.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating series of remarks to begin with. However, I am going to put down the eye and heel a little bit and say let's get on to the plane of
Yes.
immanence. And if you want to kick us off here, Matt, because simply because your notes come before mine in the Google Doc.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm having flashbacks now to last week where it's actually a difficult place to know where to start. But I suppose that is that is the central problem of the plane of immanence. That this how to introduce this, it's not a concept. So what is it? It's not so much a notion as this. It's the plane of immanence is a kind of background, I suppose, for Deleuze and Guattari, against which thought takes place.
Yes,
and I
we're
think
told
there's,
at the.
Sorry.
So yes, we're told at the beginning of the chapter that the plane of immanence is not the concept of a set of all concepts. It is something prior to concept and something prior to thought.
Yeah, which I think. I mean, I love this chapter in a lot of ways, and in the entirety of both of their sort of oeuvres, because it's something that as immediately as you sort of start talking about it, which is something that I think even takes a while for them in this chapter. There's a sense that you have to kind of they're giving a philosophical weight to something here which we would take for granted, kind of like friendship already. It's this kind of it's a plane on which everything exists. It is then this unlimited one all, as they call it. But immediately, and in this being in a book called What is Philosophy, the suggestion sort of is, what's the point of this as a again, I keep wanting to say concept because it's so counterintuitive in wanting to talk about it. But I guess that in a way, this sort of follows on really nicely from what we were talking about last week, where we talked about the body without organs as this way of trying to understand. And I mean, then they don't necessarily mean a literal body, but I think given the nature of what that concept is, it's easy to think of it that way. But a way of thinking about the body, the human body, or any kind of body, beyond the kind of restricted idea of it that we have, that is produced by things like science in one instance, but even things like psychoanalysis or even philosophy itself. How do we think about we don't really. Deleuze makes the comment in another book that we don't yet know what bodies can do, and I feel like the plane of immanence is in a way a very similar notion, but sort of taken from a further step backwards, as in once you've become a body without organs, then what are you in? And I suppose that then you are on or in or a part of this plane of immanence. And I think there's in terms of the body that Deleuze and Guattari make they have this one line which I think is quite maybe clarifying in that regard, where they say that concepts are the archipelago or skeletal frame, a spinal column rather than a skull, whereas the plane of immanence is the breath that suffuses the separate parts. So if we've gotten to a stage where we can think of the body, besides our understanding of its organs, how then do we just understand how that body exists in the world, or the universe, or without even putting any limit on things? How do we understand the thing against which that BWO exists, which is everything?
Yeah, I think it's it's reassuring to hear you struggle to articulate what the plane of immanence is, because it is it'd be tricky because the language that they use is, and it is reminiscent of the body without organs, particularly what you were saying there in that it isn't a concept. And as well as that, we'll recall that they deny that the body without organs is metaphysics, for instance. To say, no, it is just plainly real. It is just here right now. And so obviously we can have a concept of the plane of immanence, but this isn't the plane because it is not a concept. It is something that's kind of always ironic for something which is immanent. It is something that is necessarily out of the reach of thought. They at one point put it that it is what must be thought, but which also cannot be thought. There's an extent to which, I mean, it's interesting that they put it that the plane they describe it as being the image of thought, which is an interesting phrase to use, an image rather than the concept of thought. And I think this is because concept means something somewhat specific for Deleuze and Guattari. They begin the book by stating very matter-of-factly that philosophy is creating concepts. And that's why they're very derogatory of, they don't name names, but I think they clearly mean like Heidegger and so on. Those thinkers who have declared that philosophy is actually over, where we don't do philosophy anymore. They said, no, that's nonsense. Philosophy is creating concepts. And for as long as we create concepts, there will be philosophy, even if we don't call it philosophy anymore. No, it's still philosophy. It's still the same thing. I mean, it's actually a great example of Deleuze and Guattari's sense of humour coming through there, because they state in that opening saying that, look, not even the students think that's an interesting idea anymore. Look, just get past it. Philosophy's still here, and it's not going anywhere. So the concept then occupies it is a creative act. It is something that is produced. It is what the philosopher produces as a result of their labour, almost. And God, where was I going with this? So the concept means something quite specific for Deleuze and Guattari. So when they deny that the plane of immanence is a concept, they're kind of they're denying that it has the same status as the concepts of philosophy do. Like they say,
right,
as well, that the plane of immanence is not philosophy, but philosophy requires it in order to do philosophy. And later on in the chapter, they talk about how every philosopher who's ever made a name for themselves begins by setting up their own plane of immanence.
Yeah.
So I think to hazard an attempt at a brief definition of what the plane of immanence is, at about 20 minutes or so into this podcast, what the plane of immanence is, I understand it as being the conditions whereby there may be thought at a particular time, coming from a particular place. It is the horizon and the arena and the limit in the positive sense of the word, in the terms of like the granting of a form. It is the limit of a particular realm of thought. And I'm certainly getting a lot of angry Deleuze scholars in the comments saying, no, that's not what it is at all, or that I've bastardized the concept. Oh God, I called it a concept. So that's
the difficulty. But I think, because it's interesting, because I actually understood it not slightly differently, but I mean, because I don't know if, this is maybe us figuring it out live
this
as
is
we go
us
along.
as buddies doing philosophy.
Yeah, because I wonder if I feel like when I was reading this, I thought that the image of thought certainly is laid over the plane of immanence, but I almost feel like an image of thought sits within a plane of immanence, and whilst an image of thought is a limit, they're also, at the same time, they're talking about this thing that lurks behind that even, which is limitless, and we can't obviously know that, because that's kind of the plane is sort of the thing that we move across, and the limit, an image of thought, I almost feel like is like an Overton window, a philosophical Overton window, and that is sort of that is as you rightly said, that is the arena within which we are currently thinking things, but that Overton window can expand or contract or move altogether, and it's on the plane of immanence that image of thought moves.
As I think that's actually probably a better way of putting it, actually, is especially because when they're talking about what thought actually does upon the plane, they use these cartographic and navigational metaphors, obviously, like the act of turning towards truth and so on. And it's interesting where they talk about error and the role of error on the plane, where they kind of say that I can't remember exactly the details of it, but they say that we've come to like call all of the negative features of the plane error. They're saying, but there's a lot more to it than that, and there's actually a lot more dangers than that, because error ultimately is simply failing to turn toward truth. But there's other things that can happen upon the plane, and they talk about, for example, madness. You can fall into madness, or into dysphasia, or into delirium. These are all possibilities upon the plane. These are territories into which you can wander. It makes me think, and it's just because I was talking to a friend about this book actually earlier today, as I might make it my next book, because I've never been able to battle my way through it. It makes me think of William Hope Hodgson's very weird novel, The Nightlands, which is a science fiction novel written in like 1910 or something, set a million years in the future, about this traveller who's trying to navigate over the black, sunless plains of Earth, and all across and he has a direction that he's going in, which is to find this arcology called the Lesser Redoubt, but his journey is, the reason why it is thwart is because at every step of the way is the possibility of slipping into one of these literally metaphysical, like cosmic traps that's opened up upon the Earth over the last million years. And I think, but there is also like a safer pathway that he can take, and there is a destination, and there are lodestones, so to speak, whereby he can get his bearings. And actually, this is something they bring Kant up here, saying that, what Kant identifies, in the great schema of transcendental idealism, which is one of the great concepts of philosophy, and I think it's one, and I do think it's one of the ones that I always come back to. And one of the ones I do actually, this is going off a tangent. It's one of the reasons I've never quite gotten on with a speculative realist, because I do just think that Kant has set up something unassailable there. But that's beside the point. But what they identify in Kant is, like, Kant figured out that there is just part of the structure of having thoughts is this is the potential of just being detached from the truth of things. And this isn't even error in the sense of doing your maths wrong. It's just literally what having a thought is, that we're always at a permanent step removed from the noumena and so on.
Right. Which I guess is, and I think the noumena is kind of a really good example in a way, because I feel like that's kind of what they're. It's almost like the noumenal is like a really obvious reference point here that they never really mention.
Should we just to clarify?
Yeah, I guess.
Do
you want to go ahead?
So yeah, cause I imagine our audience is familiar with it, but in case they're not, by the noumenal or the noumena, we refer to Kant's notion of the thing in itself, or like you might call it the true reality of things as they actually are, beyond our limited perceptions of them. But Kant also held that we could never actually have access to the noumena, because there is a particular structure to how experience works in the first place, which is the a priori fundamental necessary structure for experience. That means that experience always arrives to us with a structure already imposed onto it by the faculties of understanding, which means that we can never actually get past those faculties. So we are always somewhat marooned from the noumena. We can never actually know what lies behind the truth of appearances. So, which, in a nutshell.
Yeah, which I think, and in a way, it's like I guess there's the distinction to be made, at least briefly, before this becomes a Kant podcast. Is that like, I guess that the Kant has the thing in itself. We can say is like the table in which I am sat recording this podcast is something that I can know through all of my senses, but I don't know what it is for the I don't know what a table is without beyond my perception of it. What is a table without me? But I think the noumena differs slightly from that, where the noumena is, the suggestion that there is the world without us, as it were, is something that we think about all the time, and kind of like a bit morbidly. We kind of love to think about things in themselves now. We like to imagine what the Earth will become and if we all become extinct, and what will happen then to the Earth once humans are no longer around to perceive it. Whereas the noumena is just something it's kind of beyond that even further still. It's something that we can't, that we can't even imagine. It's beyond our imagination even. The very true nature of things beyond, those structures that are in place. And I think the reason for bringing that up here, and maybe a reason why Deleuze and Guattari don't mention it, is that I feel like the noumenal, as Kant describes it, is like the plane of immanence, but the noumena is like the plane of immanence constricted to a concept that we are now, as readers of philosophy, for the most part, I imagine, very familiar with. Whether that's a fully understanding or whatever, but I guess the noumena is quite a very familiar concept in modern philosophy, and that in itself is kind of like a limitation. That when we start talking about this thing that can't really be thought, and then we go, oh yeah, like the noumena, then we're kind of, in a way, we're using philosophy to kind of undo itself. And especially, I think it's interesting when we can talk about how now, especially, we're kind of fascinated with a world beyond our own extinction. It's clear that this isn't quite the radical notion that it once was. We kind of engage in that on a kind of pop cultural level. We engage in that kind of thinking. So it's clear that, sort of as Deleuze and Guattari say, that philosophy isn't over. There's things to be done. In a way, as much as Kant's ideas are kind of unassailable, nevertheless, maybe there's a way that there's the chance that we need to kind of update our thinking on this, in a way that moves with the kind of passage of pop cultural thinking. How do we retain this idea of the unthinkable, of this plane of immanence, when we are kind of viewing ourselves closer and closer to a kind of void?
God, how
and
do
in that
we?
sense, I suppose, like normalizing it.
Yes, that's God, that's a thinker, isn't it? I'm not sure where to go from there.
Which is partly, I guess, I say that because that's partly, I think, why I struggle with this so much. I never want to use any familiar nomenclature, which is kind of against the sort of tenets of this podcast, that we want to kind of bring people in. But in a way, it's like Deleuze in a way wants to kind of not keep people out, but at least retain the freshness of that provocation. So we don't become complicit, and we don't limit our thinking. Because there's so many ways that could easily, it's kind of like, I mean, there's lots of analogies too, which I really like. I mean, I like a lot of, I guess another one that I was thinking of in reading this was about particle physics, as one way in which, we've seen how beyond our pop cultural thinking of a world without us, we also have this sense that, I can't even remember when it was now, a few years ago now, what was it, like 2014, that they announced they discovered the Higgs boson, which was kind of this huge sort of scientific discovery that even, I mean, I am no physicist, but it was something that I guess even the layman was bombarded with on the news as being this huge discovery. And this, I guess my no doubt faulty idea of what the Higgs boson means and signifies is it was the discovery of this a further unseen particle that gave things mass. So when we look at the universe and we see this great voids of emptiness, that void nevertheless has weight, or has mass. I mean, I'm already going back to GCSE physics and hearing my teacher tell me off then for confusing mass and weight. Anyway, but there's I think there's that suggestion that there is a void. But this void cannot be absolute, otherwise surely the universe will just collapse in on itself. And maybe it even is. So we have these new ideas that have kind of come up in the 20th century and are kind of now sort of being fortified and validated and vindicated in the 21st. That, why isn't the universe completely collapsing on itself? Why does this void have mass? What is there lurking behind what we can see that gives some sort of, that allows things to be? And I think in a way that's another sense that our understanding of what is noumenal is changing more and more. Even science is expanding its definition of what the noumenal is. And there was a sense that I kind of was digging in a bit more for Kant, and I found that there was his conception of what he calls a transcendental apperception, which is the way that we have a sort of present understanding of like a pure, unchangeable consciousness that is necessary to condition all of experience, kind of the ultimate foundation of a unit of experience. Actually, no, I don't know where I'm going with that. We can cut that too. I was trying to run through notes then and going a bit funny. I don't know my Kant well enough to even pick up on that properly.
I think this is good. I think I'm going to keep that actually, because I think what we're demonstrating here is precisely the problem that of how does one think the unthinkable. The answer is you can't, but you can try, and this is perhaps where we start running up against the mystical almost. Sort of like
yes.
Vic, I think as Wittgenstein, he says the mystical is that what lies on the edge of language, where you just kind of run into this brick wall almost, where you are no longer able to articulate a concept, if you will, and what you end up doing is slipping into analogy, where you start saying, well, it's a bit like this, it's a bit like this book, or it's a bit like this discovery from physics. And analogy is good, it's useful, it's helpful, it helps us to sound out the shape of something in the way that we can begin to think about it. But at the same time, we're talking about what lies behind thought. We're talking about what lies outside of thought, but all the same allows for there to be thought. And I think there's an extent to which some of what they do in this chapter does feel like phenomenology. And I sometimes do think that there is a lot of phenomenology going on behind the scenes with Deleuze and Guattari. Which isn't like I don't think that's an outrageous claim to make, because a lot of what they're concerned with is to just try and get at the actual lived stuffness of things, which is at least nominally what phenomenology is trying to do, even if they're trying to do it from a as we talked about last episode, from a less subjectivist perspective and from a more machinic perspective. But there is an extent to which at least some of what they're doing here is just talking about what it's like to think, what thinking is like when it happens. And they talk about the fact that when we think, there's not delays in the thoughts are just like, you have the thought and the thought is there, even if the thought is a while coming, there isn't a temporality in its arrival, if that makes any sense. We find ourselves at the thought, and they talk about how the thought turns towards us as we turn towards it. We discover the thought already kind of ready-made as we arrive at it in this infinite movement, in this movement that has no boundaries and has no duration even. So, and there's something I really like about that, just encouraging us to think what thinking is like, and the fact that we don't have to think about thinking. Thinking is a thing that happens on its own terms. It's something that we just kind of arrive at. Something we arrive at instantaneously and discover ourselves always in the midst of. And as well as that, there's an extent to which, and we're talking about, just going back to what we mentioned earlier about the reality of deliriums and madnesses and so on, that thought is not necessarily rational, but is at the same time always there. That even when we're dreaming, though dreaming is literally nothing but thought. It is and to be lost in a reverie is nothing but thought. And these are things that we find ourselves in the midst of, not things that we will. It's very difficult to will a thought. We discover that we are thinking in the same way we discover that we are in love. We don't set out to arrive there. We find ourselves always already in the midst of it.
Yeah.
Yes, again, I forget where I'm going with that, but that's why I like their language of the image of thoughts. That's why I keep coming back to the word image, and and I think perhaps we should oppose the image or the diagram with the concept, where what they are attempting to do with this chapter is to get at a diagram of thought rather than arriving at a concept of thought. And I'll be happily admit I don't fully understand even what difference I'm articulating there or attempting to articulate. But it feels almost when they're trying to be diagrammatic is an attempt to, and again this is why I come back to phenomenology, an attempt to allow thought to appear on its own terms, rather than in the creative act, the constructive act of producing a concept. The diagram is a way of presenting what we already discover is there, sort of on its own terms, but also on our terms in a way that we can grasp it. So I don't know, maybe there's an extent, again, we're running up at the same problem, isn't it? We can't ever get away from concept making.
Yeah.
You know, there's not, again, in the same way that we can't ever, you're going back to the body without organs, you know, we can never get away from the strata. We do need them to live, and we can dismantle the strata too quickly and too dangerously and arrive catatonically or schizophrenically. In the same way, you know, we can never arrive at the plane of immanence because the plane is unthinkable, and we do need thought, and we are trapped in thought. We can't get out of thought except through death or unconsciousness, but neither of those are conditions that help us understand the plane of immanence.
I think that's partly why there's this strange, a literal folding, and that's, I guess, another concept probably for another time that Deleuze has of the fold. But yeah, because I think that's the one thing that needs to be stressed, that when we talk about the unthinkable or that which, I mean, again, it's not to say but that which escapes thought, because the unthinkable is precisely a part of thought. And I think that's something that they make really clear where there's this section that I wanted to point out that was they write that if philosophy begins with the creation of concepts, then the plane of immanence must be regarded as pre-philosophical. But pre-philosophical does not mean something pre-existent, but rather something that does not exist outside philosophy, although philosophy presupposes it. These are its internal conditions. The pre-philosophical is perhaps closer to the heart of philosophy than philosophy itself, which I love that whole kind of ingrown structure. But one way I wanted to approach this, again analogously, but maybe with this point of a shared point of interest for us both, is via photography. I know you like a good picture.
I do like a good picture, yes.
When I see your photographs on Twitter, I know we've kind of talked about a few shared loves of different photographers, and one that I think I remember saying to you, or maybe you said to me, was that you took a lot of pictures that were a bit like Gregory Crutzen, who is a photographer who has these like large, these quite huge in scope photographs that are often they're immaculately composed and have this incredible lighting going on, and often seems to have these like very painterly. But I guess it's the way that he kind of uses a lot of like coloured fog a lot, which I really like. Like he plays with mist and light and how they kind of into like they mingle with each other. And in a way, I kind of feel like that's the one way I've always understood intensity. And I guess the one thing that the Deleuze and Guattari have this separation between the diagrammatic and the intensive. And I think there's I cannot take credit for this, but there's something that I think Robin Mackay has once told me that was his favourite definition of what intensity is for Deleuze actually comes from David Lynch, who has this description of the colour red and the way he uses colour in his films, and the way that a single colour and a kind of swelling colour can actually, you know, we can talk about the sort of semiotics of colour and what a colour like red makes us think of, but there's something really quite guttural and primal, something that's literally quite intense, that a single colour kind of, you know, provokes in us. It doesn't have to be red, it could be anything, but when we kind of limiting that colour to what it represents is kind of to miss the point of what the intensity of colour actually makes us feel. And so Cruzen's photographs in that way kind of become like diagrams of intensity, because when it's sort of fixed, even as beautiful as those photographs are, whether that's Cruzen's or even your own or anyone else's, you know, you kind of, when you photograph something, as much as you feel like you're capturing its essence, it's never quite the same as it was when you sort of lived it and saw it. And that's kind of not an issue of technology. You know, I don't think there'll ever be a lens that is able to see the world like our eyes see the world. But it's that tension that always used to fascinate me, because in a previous life I did my undergrad degree was in photography, and I ended up getting really frustrated with it, and I guess it's this very tension that kind of pushed me from being a photographer to ended up talking about philosophy and writing instead. Was that there's this sense that that as much as Deleuze and Guattari talk about the philosophical and the non-philosophical, there's also a kind of the photographic and the non-photographic. And I should preface this by saying that I'm aware that there's Francois Laruelle, a philosopher who's written both on non-philosophy very famously, and he also has a book on non-photography. I don't know if my own understanding of these two words matches up with his. If it does, it's by accident. I've not really read him. But either way, I feel like that when we take a picture, when we photograph something that we see in the world, we kind of we diagram it, we turn it into a concept. And I think anyone that loves taking pictures and loves photography, that's that whole process that you can get sort of so embedded in, whether that's taking the pictures, developing them, sort of arranging them, hanging them on the wall and whatever else, tweaking them, perfecting them. It's a really beautiful process in and of itself. And it aids how we look at the world. And, sort of through this kind of, this persistent and consistent, the consistency of looking through a camera, you can kind of hone the way that you see the world, and you can sort of find beauty maybe more readily, or you find your sort of you maybe understand more about yourself and what you really like to look at in the world. But when we do that through photography, there's a sense that we can actually lose that very thing that makes us pick up a camera, which is looking. We kind of through photographs, and this is something that I always had problems with a lot of photojournalism, that as much as those photographs in particular are sort of conceptions of the world, they can often be quite cold, and the person behind that camera is removed. The phenomenological perspective, as it were, the first person perspective, is kind of lost, and no pun intended, we actually end up losing sight of looking. We lose sight of that pre-photographic or that non-photographic experience that actually makes us pick up the camera in the first place. And I think it's in that similar sort of way that Deleuze means that non-philosophy is perhaps closer to the heart of why of philosophy than philosophy itself. Because it's we can talk about photographing for the sake of photographing, but really it's like those two things aren't. It's not the paradox that it seems. We're actually we're photographing for the sake of looking, and it's that kind of engagement with the world and what that experience is like when it's not limited by that kind of apparatus of the camera. That I always, at least personally, always struggled and kind of fought to try and replicate, and in sort of with a kind of knowing futility. But I always found that way of approaching, especially a creative practice, was actually way more fulfilling. It wasn't probably by any sort of standard good, and it wasn't necessarily consistent in a way that could be measured up to any sort of art historical thing, maybe. But though I think maybe there's artists now that have done a lot of work with that, but that's kind of besides the point. But I think that their approach to philosophy is very similar. That's kind of why I think Deleuze talks about philosophy as being a kind of creative act, and not just philosophy but thinking, because we can create concepts and we can play with concepts. But if we do that to the point that we then forget about thinking, or or lose sight of being rather, and what it means to be in the world, not necessarily in the Heideggerian sense, but just what it means to not just be but become, the movement of that thought and the movement of being. And I guess that's another thing that we can say about that, the sense that an image of thought passes over the plane of immanence, that there is a movement of thought there, and that movement is really important. And I think it's that I think it's because in that sense that we, like, when we try and talk about this, the concept of a plane of immanence, we kind of get, it becomes it becomes a very practical concept in a way, because as much as it's very easy to sort of fall over yourself as you try and articulate it, I almost feel like if you're not falling over yourself in trying to articulate it, then you're kind of not doing it right, because that's kind of its very purpose. If you can with any sort of categorical certainty say what it is, it's not doing what they're kind of intending it to. It's not pushing those buttons. It's not making you think about thought itself in the way that maybe we kind of become more accustomed to with other thinkers that are now sort of canonized. I think it's that why they say that that to think is always to follow the witch's flight. Sort of as you were saying before, Sean, about the coming up against the limits of language and into mysticism, or as sort of Guattari talks about the impossible in that sort of sense. To think is to fly across that plane of immanence and pass through images of thought, and in doing that, you transfigure yourself. It's not just that it's not phenomenological in the sense that it's a first person perspective, but actually that in thinking about different thoughts and understanding the differences between those thoughts, and that individuals have thought them in a way that the thought philosophy is innately about friendship, because it's about understanding other people's ideas and how they relate to your own experiences and whatever else. That whole net of they kind of he talks about putting a sieve over chaos. Is the sort of the plane of immanence of what that does, and I feel like that sieve is innately this kind of like social network. I mean, in the non sort of dystopian social media sense, of putting that sieve of interconnecting relationships across time, transhistorical thinking, as a way to process this kind of chaos of becoming and being and of the universe. And it's in that sense that I think they're saying, to think is always to follow the witch's flight, because to think is to transfigure yourself. I think that to quote Deleuze and Guattari, because one does not think without becoming something else, something that does not think, an animal, a molecule, a particle, and that comes back to thought and revives it. And I guess that's partly the point of bringing up the Higgs boson before, as this kind of new. I was kind of my limit of the research for that concept was just looking at the Wikipedia page, but I did like how there was the notes on the sort of a lead section of that page that the Higgs boson's been called the God particle, but Higgs himself, who sort of has theorized it, and a lot of other writers sort of quite adamantly reject that that name for it, because it kind of does what Deleuze in here is kind of rejecting. The Higgs boson is a particle that we kind of in discovering it, we further extend out that image of thought, that horizon around what we know about the universe. But to give it a name like the God particle suggests that it's removed. It somehow transcends the world as we know it. When it doesn't, there's no transcendence here. It's all immanent. It simply moves the goalposts, as it were, and we get a better sense in a very humanist way, potentially, of our kind of known knowns and unknown unknowns, or whatever else. The things knowledge is disrupted, but it's not ruptured. It remains intact, but actually it provides those kind of new coordinates, as you were sort of saying before, those cartographic what do they? I think they use the word ordinances or something, don't they? Of looking at what's around us and what even is around us that we can't see. And it's precisely that kind of concept that is immanent to what we already know. It fits within, it fits in this void that we'd seen, that we knew was there. We kind of theorized, at least as in terms of physics, that this thing must exist, and then when we prove it, that revives that thought. It revives scientific thought, especially into coming to terms with that now the horizon's shifted again. We've met that horizon and we've found it, and now what's next? And it's that kind of thrill, I think, that they're kind of always saying that we should be chasing. We can't sort of say, oh, that's the numino, and then be done with it. We have to find a new name for it that actually does justice to that pushing outwards of thought that is, despite appearances and despite especially the ideologies of capitalism and capitalist realism or whatever else, that kind of wants to limit thought into a very specific kind of grid, as it were. These things that push outwards happen all the time, and we have to retain our openness, I suppose, to those kinds of shift.
Yes, I absolutely agree with all of that. And I'm glad that you brought up the question of immanence itself, in contrast to transcendence, because and I think this goes all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning when we were talking about friendship. That's something that Deleuze and Guattari are very insistent about in this chapter, is that when we talk about immanence, which, the plain sense of the word is simply, the presence of things here, their immediacy. They're very insistent that immanence is not an immanence to something else. It is simply immanence. It is simply this immediacy of things, as opposed to a transcendentality, because the transcendent of a transcendental is to state the existence of something that lies. It's a difficult language to use, actually, because we have been talking about the plane of immanence as something that lies outside of thought or beyond thought, or something that is unthinkable to thought. But because when we talk about, well, actually, what we've done is we've stumbled into another one of the traps that they've identified, which is that upon the plane of immanence, one cannot help but eventually start positing the transcendent, and eventually start being lost among illusions. That just happens, and because they're very, very insistent that what they're talking about here is just the sheer immediacy of available to thought and available to being alive, almost, I guess. In fact, by denying that there is this transcendental quality which lies over and above thought, which thought cannot ever grasp because it is other to thought, but in the sense of suggesting that it is so superior to thought, the thought cannot grasp it, which they don't like. They don't like the notion of the transcendent. But even though they seem to suggest that thought cannot help but tend towards the positing of the transcendental. But what they're dealing with, and this is why, again, I think there's something phenomenological here, what they're dealing with is just the actual right here and now-ness of thinking, if that makes any sense. That that thought is something that is here right now, and it's almost, and I think that by denying the transcendent and saying that we should start with the immanent plane is to try and turn philosophy on its head, and to try and get us to stop trying to force thought and reality into transcendental categories which are actually just concepts that we've created in the first place and then act as eternal truths delivered from beyond time, rather than trying to force the chaos of becoming into what we claim are timeless categories. We should instead start with the chaos, because that actually does precede thought, while all of these transcendental categories and concepts are things that thought produces in a qualified sense, perhaps in the same way that we can produce light bulbs and glasses. These are products that we make that aren't necessarily geared towards transhistorical, eternal, metaphysical truths. They're things that we make just because of what we do. We just produce things, and we are productive creatures, including on the level of our thoughts. So by pulling us and our attention down to the immediacy of things, this is perhaps what Deleuze owes to the empiricists. Sort of like something like actually quite classical. Well, not literally classical, but some of the grand philosophical ideas here, going back to Hume and Locke, I guess, especially Hume. The idea that these concepts that we act as if they are eternal or perfect or exist on their own plane of being beyond our own, are just habits of how we think about things. So like Hume says at one point, because Descartes says something like, we can imagine a thousand-sided shape, but because we've never encountered a thousand-sided shape, this demonstrates that there's thought as a capacity to transcend itself and to conceive the perfect. But Hume points out very, very truthfully that actually no one can imagine a thousand-sided shape. You're just imagining a circle with fuzzy lines, which is true. I challenge you, listener, to imagine a thousand-sided shape and tell me it's not just a kind of like a fuzzy circle, because this does just come. They're kind of like they're being good Socratics, really, and they're just kind of still taking a pin to the balloon of our own arrogance and bursting it, and just kind of like getting us to stop kidding ourselves, really, and just to kind of like really just like come back to the brass tacks of it, and to realize that thought makes things, thought makes thoughts, thought makes concepts, and that these concepts we have history. They come from a place. They were thought by a guy doing his own thing or whatever. And indeed, this is where perhaps we should direct our discussion to next. All of our concepts were produced on a plane of immanence that a philosopher set up, rather than them emerging out of the transcendent cosmic truth of things. They're things that are produced by human labour. And I think that's something why there is, I don't know, maybe that's why they're funny. Maybe that's why there is this sense of humour you find in their works, but they are, they understand the power of humour to deliver a hard truth that to undermine our self-seriousness, or to undermine the self-seriousness of thought, and to stop it concerning itself with these supposed transcendental, eternal, Platonic ideals, but instead to come back down to the factory floor of thought, where we find that every single idea that has ever been had was produced by someone who was thinking.
But I guess it's like, what is the background to of that? It's I guess there's the humour of it, I suppose, comes from the fact that you then have to ask who produces the factory, and I guess that's partly why they have this Deleuze, and as Deleuze especially, and I think this is maybe where you see Deleuze certainly come through here more than Guattari, is the way that he comes back to Spinoza, and I do find it quite funny where he's talking about this sense of transcendence. And he talks about how Kant saves transcendence. So I guess that's what Kant takes from Hume, maybe, that suggestion that, that you're not imagining a thousand-sided shape. But actually that, that's not thought transcending itself. But, or maybe in a way it is, but it's limiting what that thought is. So as if, I think Deleuze, and this is maybe what I get from this chapter at least, he and Guattari say at one point that Kant saves transcendence by kind of limiting it, by folding transcendence within immanence. So transcendence is kind of the movement of the cloistered interiority of a subject that's limited that's limited to a subject becoming more readily aware of their place within the sort of all one. So transcendence then is like it's something that happens within immanence. It's a kind of like a consciousness raising almost. It's of your own nature, but also within nature, but also as nature. And I guess Deleuze basically sort of says that we can follow this train of thought from Descartes to Kant to Husserl, onwards to Jaspers and Sartre, but in the end we just end up having sort of a couple hundred years where we end up back at Spinoza, who he calls the prince of philosophers, the only philosopher never to have compromised with transcendence and to have hunted it down everywhere. And I guess in a way it's to sort of say that, to think about concepts of things that have already been thought, but what is thought, because, I mean, maybe there's the tension here between its machinicness, and maybe there's something that's emphasized later on by, more recently, that it's not that thought and the beings that produce thought, us, are part of nature. So thinking is in our nature, and thinking is natural, and thinking is it's Spinoza's sense of nature naturing. We're not thinkers thinking; we are nature naturing. And I guess that it's in a way it's to try and popping that bubble, as you say, as a way of in a way denouncing that sort of human exceptionalism, which is maybe why Spinoza was quite famously seen as very heretical in his time, as being as if he's sort of being kind of an atheist, because he says that he sort of takes the point that God is everywhere and God is in everything, but then says that God is all that there is. And then so we are God and animals are God, and nothing's really there's not a hierarchy in place, but actually everything is, if everything is made in God's image, it's sort of as if to say nature has its own image of thought, and when we insist that image of thought is ours, we're kind of missing the really radical notion that is thinking of ourselves not as exceptional to all that's around us, but actually in part of it and embedded within it and immanent to it. We are the immanent. We are immanence that is immanent to itself, and that's kind of that knotted of how we try to think of ourselves as being a part of nature, when we've done so much to separate ourselves from that which we already are. That kind of loop is like this. Again, it's something that you can't help but sort of trip over because of this. I guess that's one thing that Deleuze says, right? That an image of thought is not just individual but civilizational. That there is a human, there is a sense of thought being all of ours, but not in the genealogical sense. I think he says at one point that it's let me find it. Philosophers carry around a vast diversion of wisdom. They place it at the service of pure immanence. They replace genealogy with a geology. So it's not just to say that thought is produced by individuals and that thought is passed down by a line of humans, but kind of the way that Nietzsche sort of talks about how thought is produced. He sort of he suggests that Germans think a certain way because they eat so many sausages. There's a sense that the way that we think about things is innately tied to the earth, and this is really apparent in A Thousand Plateaus, especially with when they have their chapter, The Geology of Morals. What we produce thought, but what produces that thought in us? What is it that we ingest, that we live on? What kind? It's as if to say that explains while we all kind of there are very various similarities between human thinking around the globe. To what extent can we say that we know how language is, like in a sociological sense, we know how language develops based on your environment. That kind of, there's that cliche that's probably no doubt inaccurate that the Inuit people have 1,000 words for snow, as if their image of snow is vastly expanded to anybody else's on the planet because they live in it. They have this a very different sense of its variations and the differences that exist within it, and that's innately tied to the earth, tied to nature. So in a way, it's to say that it's not that they think about snow because that they're thinking about snow as produced by snow itself rather than they produce it for themselves. And I think it's that kind of immanence that that immanence in a way is that's one example, but it's kind of never ending, and it's geological in the sense that that kind of thinking is compounded over eons, literally within the ground that we walk upon and think with and think upon. So that we literally cannot separate these things from one another. Not just in the sense that we are a part of nature, but actually it's nature that produces those thoughts. In a kind of sort of spiritual sense, but also in a very material sense. And all of that gets folded in together, I think, in the Plane of Immanence.
Building on what you were saying there, they make some very interesting remarks about the plane of immanence as it kind of like directly relates to philosophy, because they tell us that if there is a plane of immanence or the plane of immanence, because although I don't think we've been doing it, they do speak of it in the plural. With like I said earlier, every philosopher creates a plane or sets up a plane of immanence upon which to create their concepts. But what they and this is why it's important. But you brought up the geological language, the language of the building up of the strata, because they give a really just a fascinating idea of what philosophy is, or image of philosophy here, where they tell us that we are accustomed to thinking of philosophy as possessing a history, and in fact, Heidegger might, who's the philosopher I've read the most of and studied the most, considers the history of philosophy to be of like enormous importance, like paramount importance, but Deleuze and Guattari deny that we should think of philosophy rather in historical terms, and that's by which they, or how I understand them, by which they mean that we shouldn't think of philosophy as progression, from one point to another, and then to another, to another, while we're always kind of like getting closer and closer to the truth, whatever it may be. But if we're talking about in terms of geological strata, the strata of the planet, if you take a core of somewhere and then count the strata, what you do not have there is evolution. You don't have progress from a more primitive strata to a more advanced strata. What you have there are distinct layers which were produced in distinct ways and are now piled atop one another. And if we think of philosophy in this way, we move beyond the idea that philosophy is this kind of like linear progression from error to truth, but is rather the sedimentation of productive activities, of productive thought acts, building atop one another, but not necessarily directly borrowing from one another. But what they also tell us is the result of this is that one of these prior stratas can erupt into the present, and we could even think of this happening volcanically, or that the thoughts of the past can suddenly explode up into the future. And actually, I'm tempted to bring in the dreaded hauntology here, because certainly one way of thinking about hauntology is or at least like to go all the way back to Derrida, that and his discussions about the nature of the spectre that haunts Europe. One of the ways to think about what's going on in that text in Spectres of Marx is that the haunting which continues to haunt is the possibility of communism, or the possibility of the radical alterity of the future in the new society. And precisely the hauntingness of that is significant, because to be haunted, for a place to be haunted, is to announce that time isn't settled there, that things that have happened in the past aren't over, and in fact keep coming back because there's work to be done still, which isn't yet done. And you can think perhaps of their conversations about the multi-leaved strata of the plane of immanence of philosophy itself, where there's always the possibility that a plane, that a way of thinking or an image of thought from earlier is suddenly going to push its way up to the surface again, and suddenly we're going to meet one another and create our concepts on a very different plane of immanence to the one that we started off at, that we suddenly and there's something kind of I love this because there's something always transhistorical about this, the idea that it is actually kind of in principle always possible to arrive at the thought of a prior age or of a different age, that we aren't actually. I mean, this is this is something that actually that we come back to again and again in all sorts of cultural arenas. Like the very notion of Renaissance is to say that sort of like the last 500 years of planes of imminence weren't good enough, so we're going to go back to what the plane was like 1,000 years ago. Obviously, that's not what the Renaissance is, but but this is, and in Catholic theology in the 20th century, there was the and I'm going to butcher it because it's a French word, the ressourcement or ressourcement movement, which was precisely again saying, so, fuck the last 1,000 years of dogmatic scholasticism. Let's just go back to the plane of immanence that the church fathers dwelt on, and start from there instead. So there's this notion almost that you can bypass the last few hundred years if you want to go back 1,000, because the plane was better 1,000 years ago than what it was 100 years ago, and this undermines these Whig notions of the clear progress, the clear evolutionary progress of thought from error to truth. And again, as they put it, but while you're traversing the plane of immanence, you can just like fall into a delirium, and you can imagine that happening, so to speak, happening culturally for a couple of hundred years. That culture can just go insane for a while, and then has to try find its way back to a better position to start thinking again. And there's something just really quite oddly hopeful about that that I like, and I will quote it, although I don't. Although we agreed actually before we started this podcast, this isn't a CCRU podcast or Nick Land podcast. I do recall a remark from Meltdown, which is, if you want to find ice, try think about what is blocking you out of the past. It certainly isn't a law of nature, and this is something that other thinkers in the accelerationist sphere, like Vince Garton, have talked about the idea of that actually not only is the future getting closer, but the past is getting closer as well, and that we can access the thoughts of the past actually a lot easier than maybe the thoughts of the last 50 years, that the thoughts of the last 200 years might actually suddenly have a lot more relevance to us, or be a lot more useful for us to do philosophy with than ideas that were dreamt up 50 years ago.
Because I suppose it's worth noting this book is fairly recent, at least for Deleuze and Guattari, because I think that their first collaboration is Anti-Oedipus, which is sort of known as the book of May 68 in France. But What is Philosophy wasn't published until 1991, the year of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so it's interesting really to think that that's, 1991 is kind of when the end of history supposedly starts. It's precisely at that moment that the, capitalism kind of stratifies, rather reifies itself as being kind of the ultimate victor, the sort of final image of thought that we will land upon, and there is no alternative, as Thatcher said. But it's almost as if it's precisely at that moment that they drop this and sort of say, as if they're kind of seeing the future almost, as if to say, it's precisely at this moment that we're going to have to ask ourselves again, what is philosophy? What is it for? And it's precisely maybe that question that will get us out of the sort of this dark period, these dark ages, this new period of sort of vicious reaction that is to come, and which we're still sort of in the midst of, and although hopefully maybe in the tail end of, where we're kind of now thinking, as Mark Fisher wanted to do. He wrote post-capitalist. He wrote Capitalist Realism in 2009, and then recently we've just been published his final lectures where he's talking about a post-capitalist desire, but doing that by going back to the 70s, as if to say, here's this moment of political thought that was utterly vanquished, supposedly, by neoliberalism, but has continued to kind of, the potentials of which have continued to haunt us. And that's kind of what they talk about here, right, Deleuze and Guattari, where they're talking about the philosopher is kind of the friend, the philosopher's friendship to wisdom is kind of like a friendship to the potentiality of the concept. And I think, in a way, what I've continued to find really striking about the CCRU and their various associates, some more than others, it probably should be said, is that there is a sense that there's a radical friendship to potentials there, both past and future, which is, I guess, precisely what we need really at this moment in time, where, as you say, the future's rushing in to meet us just as the past is. We have this new, increasingly as time progresses, we have a better cultural memory. We're able to retrieve more, and record better, archive better. So these things that are supposedly vanquished, they never quite get lost. At least you'd hope so for the future. And now with these new things that we thought were dead and buried are coming out coming out of the coalface, maybe, as it were. And those potentials need to be held up again, because that is the work of philosophy.
Yes, and I think, and perhaps this is a bit tangential, but just thinking about because the accusation that's often made of hauntological media is that it is simply playing with nostalgia, and that's definitely true of, like, for example, Stranger Things, which is clearly just it is an extended exercise in nostalgia, which isn't to say it's not an enjoyable one, but where with the interesting and successful pieces of hauntological media is maybe the reason people like them, it isn't because it's some kind of like infantilized nostalgia, but because actually certain artistic forms that were prevalent in the 80s, for instance, they were better. They actually just they accomplished things that we're not able to accomplish so easily anymore, and that there were things that were happening culturally at those points which aren't happening on their own terms now. So we need to burrow, take a spade and dig down through the strata, dig down through the planes of immanence to find where these things were happening, so that because they're useful. If we want to extend our metaphors a little bit here, we can imagine, sort of like us as archaeologists looking for an important artifact that's actually going to help us understand things that are happening in the here and now, because the here and now hasn't given us the tools to do so on its own terms. So we have to go back. Because we have to find bits of I don't know, almost like it's almost kind of like faintly new agey, this almost, the idea that, in the past things were understood which have been forgotten. We need to discover the lost wisdom of the ancients, almost, or something like that. Something, as Umberto Eco point out, is actually a little bit fascist, so maybe wary of that. But at the same time, there were part of it is perhaps, the discovery that the present isn't actually all it's cracked up to be, and that the future was more real at points in the past than it is now in the present. And this is something that obviously that Mark Fisher puts across extremely well, is the fact that the problem is that the future Gibson was William Gibson was wrong. The problem isn't that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. The problem is that the future has been foreclosed, but there were cultural moments still in memory, and both in living memory and in archival memory, where the future was more real, and we can actually access the future through the past, therefore, by going back to these points in thought where it was possible for thought to grasp a radical alterity in the future than is available to thought which only thinks in terms of what is available on the present plane of immanence. And actually, there's a remark from a novel by John Crowley, who wrote Little Big, which is a book that I became obsessed with last year. And it's either from The Solitudes or from Love and Sleep, where he has this wonderful line where he talks about how the further we've gone into the future, the bigger the past has become. And he means this quite literally in some ways, just the fact that our ability to discover what happened in the past has expanded due to scientific and technological discoveries. It does also mean this kind of more poetically as well, that the further away from the past we get, the more important we realise the past has become. But again, we're talking about, we've portrayed our Deleuze Guattari ethos here by talking about these things in terms of history rather than in terms of the strata of the planes through which we travel. So, blimey, I don't know. Is there, is there anything else you would like to add, Matt? I feel like we haven't answered the question of what is the plane of immanence, but I also think that was somewhat the point. So.
Yes. Yeah. I guess. It's kind of it's the point that makes me feel better anyway. That if you have defined if you have defined it utterly, you've broken it. The point is that it should be pulling you in this way and that, and I think it's definitely pulled us this way and
that. We have this whole experience has been traversing the plane of immanence, has been traversing the Nightlands together as friends, as buddies, indeed.
As buddies.
Because you, listener, you dear listener, are our buddy as well, our buddy in spirit, even if not in person. But God, we should do the bullshit, shouldn't we? So the social medias, you can find myself on Twitter at Horntonaut. Matt, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Xenogothic on Twitter or xenogothic.com. And I guess we can now add that you can find this podcast at BWO_pod or on the URL that as we've only just acquired, and I think it's marvelous, which is buddieswithout.org.
It is. I'm very happy that we bought that, or rather that you bought that, because I've not given you my money yet.
It had to be done.
Yeah, God knows what we're going to do with it. We've talked about like maybe trying to sort of take our notes and producing some kind of suitable written content that can go up onto the website, which hopefully I think we should do. At some point in the future, we'll probably think about merch, but not tonight, not at 9:10 on a Thursday. But yes, thank you everybody for listening. I, for one, am delighted and amazed at how how big the response we've got for this podcast has been already. You know, episode 1 has had like 500 hits over the last 2 weeks, which is it's better than like the other podcasts I've done has managed. So that's really good. People seem to enjoy what we're doing, which is lovely. We've had yeah, I don't know. If you like what we've done here, please like, subscribe, retweet, and so on. Please spread the good word if you'd be so kind.
Yeah, come bring more buddies to the Buddies podcast.
But no organs. Only buddies. No organs. Right. Well, until such a time as when, I've been Sean.
And I've been Matt.
Thank you for joining us.
Buddies.